understanding what the underlying shifts are, and then where you need to optimize and transform. Dealing with a very fast changing environment, more emergent approaches are of course far better, because there you can learn and you can understand what works and what doesn't work. And that's really where you need to apply Agile principles, to actually do that testing and learning, to be emergent in your approach and to find out what works and what doesn't work. Opportunities in applying technology to transform. And there you need to unlearn and relearn. You really need to rethink business models, processes, how you do things, because technology is creating new possibilities. The most effective leaders from an innovation agility point of view that actually get to that level of experience still have curiosity, still are open-minded, still have that kind of beginner's mind. So to my mind, that would be my message to leaders, is you've got to try and work hard at keeping that.
This week, we talked to Neil Perkin, who is the author of Building Agile Business Through Digital Transformation. This is the third book on the Agile theme that Neil has written. And so we had a great conversation with him about what Agile methodology really looks like for business leaders who are trying to carry out change in their organization. Additionally, Neil is a keynote speaker, and he's the author behind Only Dead Fish, a blog in which he explores and goes deeper into the ideas that we cover in the interview. Enjoy the conversation.
You're a writer and a speaker and a blogger, and I want to separate blogger from writer, because you've got 3 books: Agile Transformation, Agile Marketing, Building the Agile Business Through Digital Transformation. All the clever kids out there are going to see the theme in the books. But Only Dead Fish is a blog, and it's not a Johnny Come Lately blog. It's vintage 2010, which is 13 years of consistent posting and blogging. So, and then on top of that, as alluded to by the poster in the background, you speak, and you don't speak here, just here and there in the local circuit. I was seeing like Istanbul and Australia and Peru. So you are called upon to hit a number of topics that I think are burning for people on a speaker's circuit as well. Is that fair, Neil? Where are you kind of investing most of your attention now?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite tricky, I think, Kevin. When people ask me what I do, there's no short answer to that, really, because how I usually answer that, because there's so many different things, but how I normally answer that is that I work at the intersection of leadership, digital and business transformation, and organizational agility, those 3 things. So I do a lot of work with leadership teams from board level down, helping them to understand how they can change ways of working to be more responsive and adaptive. But I also focus a lot on digital strategy and navigating technological change and emerging technologies. All of them, I think, really overlap, a lot extensively. So, happy coincidence that, my background really is in digital, and obviously I've worked a lot in digital transformation, but the need for agility, I think, speaks to both of those things.
Well, and I don't think we'll have a lot of time to get into it, but it's not like you're just sort of theory and ideas guy either. You're a humanities student, so I'd expect some of that from you. But Fraggle is at least one place where you're rolling up the sleeves and doing things. You're at a coalface in at least one venue as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've tried a number of different sort of side projects out, but I think for me, a lot of work I do is kind of consultancy, and I speak a lot, obviously, as you say, at conferences, and I do lots of workshop work facilitation with leadership teams. So I think probably it's important to have your hands on and to really get stuck into it, and not just stay in the theory too much, and to connect the theory through to execution, really, which is what I try to do.
Well, I should give you a hint into the typical denizens of the SAGE community. We have a headquarters in Singapore, and Singapore is always code for all of Southeast Asia. It's really like 10 to 12 separate markets, but every one of them is sort of surprisingly unique within that geography. and there's a ton of things going on in those economies. And so within that geography, we work a lot with professional services. Professional services can be serious Luddites in the field that you're looking at. Law firms, for example, are not known as being great digital transformation agents. Neither would be sort of government risk consultancies or financial advisory firms. So I'm excited to sort of make your work and thinking known to them. And I think as we have the conversation, you can keep some of those types of folks in mind. Directors, country directors, founders of professional services organizations in that part of the world.
Yeah, sure. And I think probably just to add to that, I think, often people tend to think of, principles and ways of working like Agile as being relevant just to technology or digital teams. And the fact is obviously that it's not. There's lots of organizations now which have scaled Agile ways of working and thinking right across the organization, and many different types of organizations as well. And I work across lots of different sectors, which really, I think, shows that.
Yeah, I have a proposition for you, which is to sort of go an unconventional path through some of your writing. Near the end of the book that we're talking about, near the end, you've got 5 dimensions of change, and I think this is a super like bookmark on what you're mentioning. The dimensions of change are not changing your tech stack. I'll read them out, and let's maybe pick them off as you like. Personal, principles, process, practice, pace. So, I mean, at least only one of those would be the tech stack, but there's a lot of other vectors for change that you're covering and discussing.
Yeah, and I think probably the thing I was really trying to get across in the book with those 5 principles is the kind of multi-dimensionality of change, I suppose. And too often I think the focus is on the tech stack, like you say, and the tech stack is really important because it's an enabler. But then I also think managing the personal change, the personal element of a change program can be really challenging, can be really difficult for leaders. And so that, I think, is an interesting dimension of change. How you apply the principles, of course, I talk a lot about that, because that is really about at the core of attaining greater agility. And of course, the process bit is really the fundamental kind of methodology which we're talking about here, which has much broader application apart from technology. And then finally, I think probably the pace bit for me is important because the recognition of the fact that culture, for example, changes at a much slower pace than other things like process and principles and so on. So reflecting the fact that actually you need to take a more sort of subtle approach to how you really manage that change.
Let's touch on pace, because I think there's a very key challenge that folks in leadership face, which is they don't want to mistake disruption in the Clay Christensen sense for what otherwise is just distraction, a shiny thing. And pace can be the thing that this drumbeat in the background, feeling like you'll be left out or you're going to get netscaped, can be a real fear for them. So once, like, some of what I hear you saying and writing is that things are moving very, very quickly, and things are moving not so quickly. So like, how does someone in that leadership seat where the responsibility sits go, how do I slice between what is probably a structural disruption versus what is actually just a distraction? It's a disruption in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, I think, because there's so much noise around so many different things, different technologies, different things happening. And I think the skill really to separate signal from noise, to understand the underlying shifts from perhaps the fads which come and go, is really key. So for me, it's about understanding what those more fundamental shifts are. So for example, artificial intelligence right now is seeing a lot of focus, particularly on generative AI, and that will change a lot of stuff. So that is a quite fundamental change. But there is lots of other things perhaps which come and go, and which might be here for, just 6 months or something. Everybody's talking about them. The famous hype cycle, of course, from Gartner talks about that kind of initial sort of focus where there's not very many good use cases yet, but everybody's really getting really hyped about the new technology. So I think, for my mind, it's about understanding what the underlying shifts are, and then where you need to optimize and transform. So in my second book, Agile Transformation, I talk a lot about the opportunity that comes from applying technologies to optimize. So you're not really changing much here apart from the way in which you do things. So you're looking to become more efficient, you're bigger, better, faster, and so on. There's lots of value, of course, in doing that. But there will also be opportunities in applying technology to transform. And there you need to unlearn and relearn. You really need to rethink business models, processes, how you do things, because technology is creating new possibilities. And so that, to me, is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, I think, for leaders when they're navigating technological driven change.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose if I'm hearing you correctly, that also reserves the possibility that they get it wrong, but they haven't bet the farm. If they've gotten it wrong, so maybe they read noise for signal, or rather, they heard noise, they thought it was signal, they made a bet, but in the way that you describe it, they haven't sort of put all their chips on black and lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things about Agile and Agile principles is of course safe to fail experimentation. And there's a real subtlety here around understanding what is safe to fail and what's not safe to fail, and how you can test and learn in a way that enables you to learn fast, but also protects your business and protects your reputation, all of those things which are really important to especially established businesses. So definitely, when you're actually looking at something new, you're innovating, you're dealing with a very fast changing environment, more emergent approaches are of course far better, because there you can learn and you can understand what works and what doesn't work. And that's really where you need to apply Agile principles, to actually do that testing and learning, to be emergent in your approach and to find out what works and what doesn't work. But that requires changing mindsets, changing processes. It really does augment quite a bit of change in the organization.
Yeah. Let's talk about practice a second. I'm going backwards. I started at the end of your book, and I'm going to go through your list backwards if you'll indulge me. On practice, you include Dave Snowden's Sinefin model. So people can just look this up on their own, and it's not a wise idea to try to communicate verbally what's a great visual. But he's got complex, complicated, chaotic, obvious in a quadrant. And then there's a connected set of practices. This is great. Everybody's heard of best practice. Fine. But that's in the obvious quadrant. He's also got emergent practice connected with what's complex, good practice connected with what's complicated, novel practice connected with what's chaotic. When you're talking about practice, what's actually included in that?
So I think you mentioned Dave Snowden's Sinefin work, and I think I'm a big fan of his work. And so that is all to do with the context for decision making, and understanding the domain in which you're operating. So is it a complex problem? Is it a complex adaptive problem? Or is it just a complicated problem? Or is it something where perhaps you need to do what you did before, but you need to make sure that you're doing it in the same way? There's a very different context between the different approaches that you need to take in those domains. If it's something which is driven by best practice, you want to make sure that actually you're efficient as an organization, but there'll be areas perhaps where you need to do things in exactly the same way every single time. That really is all about efficiency. It's all about standardized practice. There's areas of high risk where you want to perhaps do things in exactly the same way, or it's because it's more efficient. There's lots of reasons why that might be the case. But complicated and complex adaptive problems really are very different. You need to take different approaches to how you solve those problems, and that's where a more emergent approach can actually help you. And one of the phrases which I use in the second book is think big, start small, scale fast, which is, really a way of actually understanding how you can be more emergent, perhaps in an unknown environment. You're dealing with unknown unknowns, and so you need to kind of test and learn in order to find your way through and develop what your strategy is, or what the product is, or what the solution is.
What do you see when you're workshopping? So, Neil, you're doing a lot of consulting, you're doing a lot of taking groups through this. You're being parachuted in, or you're showing up not from the very start, but once things are kind of mid-evolution. When you think about Snowden's quadrants, where are you finding people? What do you see? Any patterns?
I guess the overarching pattern is that generally teams don't really think about different contexts of decision making, and there might be some sense of we need to test and learn a bit in more areas, but they're not seriously thinking about what type of problem they're solving really when it comes down to it, and so they're not adapting approaches to solve those problems in different ways. I guess the other thing which I spend a lot of time on in my facilitation work is around the mindset piece. Because Agile is so much a mindset that enables a process, and what we're talking about here is applying the principles really. So I encourage teams not to get lost in the methodologies really, because for me 95% of the value is in that sort of mindset shift really, from more linear fixed ways of working into more adaptive and agile ways of working. So the way in which you apply the principles. And so much of that is about mindset and how the team works, and the kind of cultural environment you have within the team, the psychological safety within the team. There's all kinds of different elements in that which actually are necessary if you're going to actually introduce true agile ways of working into a team or an organization.
I'll just, if it's all right, I'll share a leaf out of our book. It's a metaphorical book, not a real one like yours, unfortunately, Neil. We focus as an organization on how companies teach and learn. That's the dimension that we care about most and sort of spend most of our time. And one of the principles that's very old, it's 2,000-year-old principle, is praxis, which is to say it's fine to give verbal assent to something, or even full cognitive mindset level assent to something. But what happens is when people have to enact it in their work, meaning they have to take some risk, make some choices, put themselves out there, not just think things but do things based on how they think, that's actually when the theoretical pieces come to be true or false, and so forth. And so praxis is this sort of living a principle. I love this distinction you made. You can muck up the process and get little process pieces wrong, so long as you stick on the North Star of some of the principles. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but with something like Agile, if you start doing it and it doesn't work, then the principles aren't true, or maybe they're misapplied. But at least that's how they should be exercises in real life on real projects. It's not a whiteboard exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's lots of opportunity to think carefully about where do you do Agile, where do you not do Agile, how you apply the principles. There's no one way of doing it. I mean, a lot of advocates of various methodologies will say that this methodology is way better than any other. And I simply don't believe that to be true. I think really it's about context. It's about every organization being different. And so there's likely to be, certain principles or ways of working which will better suit that organization. And so I think there's no silver bullet. There's no one way of doing it. I often talk about being agile to do Agile. What I mean by that is that you've got to actually learn about the best way of making it work within your organization. And that is a learning process in itself. So you're likely not to get it right from the beginning.
That's great. That's an indication that there's probably some deeper truth in it, in that to begin to do it, you have to start doing it. You can't sort of study up for the exam and then ace it, as it were.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned learning there, and I sort of talk a lot about learning in the context of teams and organizations, because ultimately what I see really being core to agile ways of working is the ability to learn fast and learn fast at scale. And so you're moving from a context where lots of competitive advantage came from organizational efficiency and how big you were and scale that you're able to leverage, and that's still true. But I think far more advantage now is also coming from how fast you can learn, and how fast you can actually put new things into practice, or how you can learn about the best way of solving problems, or speed to market, all kinds of different sort of ways of doing that. So learning for me is absolutely essential.
And what have you seen there?
So I think one of the things that I would emphasize there is one analogy I really like here is kind of like stocks and flows of knowledge, right? So if you think about stocks and flows in an economic context, your stock of knowledge or capital, if you like, in the sort of financial sense, your stock of capital is your kind of your given value of that capital at a moment in time. And then the flow is like your cash flow that sort of goes up and down, of course. And so the cash flow in, means that your stock goes up, and your kind of flow out, of course, means that your stock perhaps goes down. And so using that analogy, if you think about organizational knowledge in terms of stocks and flows, then you have the knowledge which exists within the organization. That's like your stock of knowledge. That's what the organization actually knows. Your objective here, of course, is to capitalize on that knowledge stock, to share that knowledge as widely as you can, to make sure you've got good collaboration and good ways of actually amplifying that knowledge within the organization. But you also need a flow of knowledge into the organization. That's about external perspectives, interesting ideas, different ways of thinking, the kinds of things that can actually stimulate new ideas and new thinking within the organization. And then the kind of outflow of that is how the organization applies that new knowledge in terms of innovation and new propositions and using technology. So for me, it's about the kind of stock and the flow that you might have around knowledge, and learning, of course, is central to that.
Help me solve a problem then that we see in the world of teaching and learning at work. You can charge any number of any kind of price for a given piece of training. Let's say you get an external expert in to train, but actually the hidden cost is the time cost. So you can have a genius. You could have Neil Perkin come in and teach your people for a day, but that's a lot of man hours that go into that day. That's the expensive bit, even if they pay full freight for your work. When you're sharing with me about flows, right? In flows, it sounds to me like people won't necessarily know exactly what they have to have flowing in. It could be anything. That they could have somebody come in and teach mindfulness. Somebody else comes in and teaches the basics of CRM usage. Another person comes in and teaches agile methodology, and on and on. The catalog's extremely long.
Yeah.
And the time cost is going to feel very expensive for that leader looking at that catalog and saying, how do I triage this? So what have you seen there? Like how does an organization keep that flow coming in and still be thrifty with that expensive resource, which is time?
Well, I'm quite a fan of the sort of 70-20-10 approach, which is often used in learning and development. And the origins of that is basically the principle that 70% of your learning comes from kind of working on it yourself and working with the people in the team and so on. And then you got the 20 and 10%, and the 10% is like formal training, and the 20% might be sort of coaching, mentoring, and so on. So you've got different ways of learning. But the principle here is that actually you have a kind of mainstay of ways in which you're learning, which might be actually the internal kind of focus and the internal knowledge that you have within the organization. But then you might have the need to inject 10% of new ideas, new thinking, and different thinking within the organization. To my mind, I think the biggest mistake here that teams and organizations make is they focus on best practice within the industry all the time. And so it's like, they sort of think, well, it's not relevant unless it's a, I don't know, pharma example or a finance example. So it's always about what's going on in our sector, what can we learn from what's going on in the same industry as us. And to my mind, you should be on top of that anyway. It's like you should really understand what's going on in your own sector and look at the best examples of what's going on in your own sector. But actually, I think that arguably the more interesting stuff is things that are happening in other sectors and how you can take that principle, that idea, and that concept, and then apply it in your marketplace, because then you'll be the first to do it. And then that will create real competitive advantage for you. So to my mind, that kind of external perspective is really valuable. And but maybe if it's 10% of what you do in terms of building knowledge in the team, but it's still an important 10%.
Yeah. That's we'll lose the whole rest of the conversation on that one if we only hang around that watering hole. But I think that's good wisdom. Certainly in some of the organizations that we see that do really well, they speed to this what I was calling praxis. So they have clever people that are constantly browsing for interesting topics to learn. But when those clever people come on something and they detect, look, there's something more significant here, there's something of greater depth, they don't automatically book a all hands workshop. They put it to work, they try it on one proposal, they put it out in one configuration, they pull in a good client and test balloon. And then as a groundswell of some conviction forms around it, we may see them say, this needs to become part of standard practice here. And it just emerged from that sort of constant browsing. It could be reading, it could be conversations with clients and customers. It could be any number of external flow. But that first touch only needs to be sort of one person's fractional piece of time. And then there's some mechanism, Neil, to me, it's still a mystery. There's some mechanism that happens which grows the assent for that piece of learning or knowledge or practice, and then it gains.
Yeah, I think.
What do you make of that? Do you think I'm onto something? Have you seen that as well? Does it match Agile method?
Yeah, so one of the ways that I have of talking about technological driven change is the idea of technology S-curves. And so this is basically came originally, I think, from a study done on technology adoption, I think by Ray Kurzweil, who's now at Google. But so the idea of an S-curve is that technology adoption starts off with a slow rate of adoption at the beginning, and that might last for years. AI has been around since the 1960s, of course. But then it goes into this kind of hockey stick growth where it's scaling very rapidly, and then eventually the technology will mature and it will plateau off. So hence you get that S-curve shape. So to my mind, that sort of first bit where the technology is relatively immature is the time when you need to perhaps experiment, but you do it at a sort of small scale. And things like AI, it's pretty obvious that is going to change everything. That's one of those big fundamental shifts. So every company, frankly, should have been experimenting with that for a few years at least, because it's obvious it's going to change a lot of things. So as new versions of that or new capabilities that arrive, I think it's important that they scale up their experimentation. So they're actually scaling with the technology itself. So I'd probably say that would be an important approach.
Let me see if I can challenge you on that. The technology S-curve would be a line that describes the successful adoption of a successful technology. But for every S-curve that we plot, there would be some that actually go dit, boink, and they just fall to zero, because that's a healthy part of the process.
Sure, yeah. So I think, in fact, there was a really interesting study that was done by venture capitalists, I think, on 20 years worth of Gartner hype cycles. And one of the big learnings from that was that there were technologies which came and went within the space of a year or 2 years on that hype cycle. So the thing that, to my early point about signal and noise, I think the skill really here is understanding what the fundamental shifts are and not getting sidetracked by perhaps things which are, a small element of a more fundamental shift, or something which might, come and go very quickly. So and timing is of course key here as well, because it's really all about understanding when something is about to go into that hockey stick growth period, and it's going to scale very rapidly. If you don't act, and you don't act soon enough, you're going to get left behind. So it's really also about just understanding when something is reaching the kind of stage of capability, when it's likely to scale. And you might sort of read a lot of stuff about that technology, but the best way of understanding that is really, what does it mean for our business, and whether we've tested and experimented with it and understood the potential it has for our business. So yeah, I think the answer is systematic experimentation, really, not just episodic experimentation.
Okay. The picture that I get when you're saying that is a lot of maybe organizations or individuals would hope to look for the indicators of that inflection point by being in the stands with the observers, the enthusiastic sports observers. But you're kind of saying that's not the place where you're really going to be able to build conviction watching everybody else and sentiment. You sort of need to understand it for your own organization by tinkering.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there is value in being a fast follower, perhaps, in some situations. And some organizations have created huge value by being a fast follower. And once somebody else has done something and they just followed it, but they've done a better version of it, and it's really scaled for them. But I think ultimately, unless you really do it yourself and find out how it works for your organization, it's really actually difficult to just take something and then just drop it into your company and expect it to create value in the short term.
Yes. I want to make a total jump. There were one or two sections where I just marked them and thought, well, I've got to ask Neil about those. And one of them is, why do good ideas become battles? I loved this. One in some kind of halcyon view of an organization and its future, you just go, oh, a good idea shows up and all people of good faith recognize it for its goodness, and it takes off and we race to the finish line together. No, Neil, good ideas become battles. So can you give us a few words there?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a quote actually, which I use, but it's very true, I think, because often, particularly in large organizations, I think it's very hard to introduce new ideas in a way that sticks. And if you're working in a certain part of the organization and you have a certain view and you have a certain sort of insight for a new way of doing things, to try to scale that rapidly across the organization is really hard. And so one of the reasons I think, one of the reasons for that is because I think organizations become almost like sticky over time, and they become quite resistant to change. And part of the reason for that is because of the relationship status between different people in the organization. And so it becomes a social thing. It's like, if you have a new proposition or product or something which actually changes the dynamic of power and status within the organization, people don't like that. And people are very protective about status and how many people are in their team and what their budget is, and all the rest of it. It's very hard to get past those kinds of barriers. And so therefore, if you come up with a good idea in the business, sometimes it can be really hard to just get people on side, get them to understand what that idea is, and get them to see the worth in that idea, and to get people motivated. And you end up doing so much work in a large organization to build a consensus around a particular idea that it just takes too long, and that's why it's a battle.
Yeah, I was cheekily thinking that in your 5 dimensions of change, they're all P's. Maybe there needs to be a 6th P, which is politics.
Well, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's inevitable to a degree you'll get politics within an organization, but I think there's healthy debate and healthy disagreement, and healthy being able to challenge in a healthy way. And there's also the kind of internal politics which just slows you down, where you've got the kind of disagreement where you've got decisions go up and down in the organization, and just everything is really slow because of the kind of dynamics involved with it. So I think the culture, that's part of the reason why culture and behavior is so important with agility.
Yeah, we're working currently with a university who is introducing the concept of disruption and shiny object syndrome as two parallel concepts that need balance. The word that you used was debate, healthy debate. And obviously, if you have only cheerleading enthusiasts for any given change that comes down the pike, there's a great danger in it. And obviously, if you only have Luddites clinging to the past of their organization, there's a danger in it. So ideally, you want a few of them at the table. I just used ridiculous extremes of the two, but you want a guardian group that's going to vet and prove change, and somebody to champion it and try to carry it through. Is that fair? Is that what you see in your consulting work?
Yeah, although I think you've got risks involved with that as well, or challenges, should I say, because if you have like a head of innovation in an organization, and that person might be charged with bringing in new ideas and trying to make things happen, if that person has no kind of power or influence, they're going to really struggle. I really feel for people put in that position and put in that situation, because they're expected to drive change, and they just haven't got the potential of actually doing that. So for my mind, I think one of the challenges in a way is how the organization can experiment around new ideas, but then not just experiment around new ideas to create new propositions, how it then scales and operationalizes those ideas. Yeah. So lots of organizations, for example, will have a innovation team or a department, which will be sort of working away, and they may come up with brilliant ideas and great concepts and so on. But as soon as that gets dropped into business as usual with a division or area of the business, it struggles to survive, because the business as usual area is not used to running it, and then it's usually additive. So it's like, do what you did before, but do this as well now. And so and they're not bought into it because they haven't been, part of that from the beginning. So I think that the politics of that is interesting and difficult to navigate, but also, what's the kind of structural implications of that? It's like having a team that does this and then handing over to another team that does that is like, that's quite problematic in its own way. So, that's why I talk quite a lot about the role of small multidisciplinary teams, which is, of course, another agile principle, and how valuable they can be at encouraging concurrent working and enabling different functions and disciplines to actually work concurrently together to solve problems, which is far more efficient.
I hear you. So I think maybe I was putting forward a notion that's kind of bipartisan exchange, whereas maybe something healthier, sort of nonpartisan process.
Yeah, I guess it's all wrapped up together, isn't it? So I think for me, the whole idea of psychological safety is a really interesting idea, and is completely really aligned with what's needed with greater organizational agility. And if you break that down, to me, psychological safety is really about trust and respect, but it's also about comfort with dissent. It's also about being able to have that healthy debate and disagreement, because that helps you to solve ideas better, and it means that everyone can contribute. So you're actually getting better ideas, more ideas, but you're also able to solve problems better. So that's really why the structure is related to the culture, is related to everything else. So the whole thing is intertwined, I think.
I'd like to sort of direct your wisdom to two very different audiences. Consider, on the one hand, people who are in leadership. They get to that position for a reason. A lot of experience. They have a lot of tread wear on their tires. And so just by age, they're kind of 50 plus. You know, I'm particularly thinking again about professional services. So managing partners, managing directors, country directors, and so on. I don't think it's quite as simple as like, well, these are going to be change resistant folks or slower, et cetera. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. But what is your message to folks who have that leadership mantle in terms of how they, with their leadership and their experience, need to participate?
So I think as you become more experienced in an industry, sector, business, whatever, I think you know, the value of that experience is huge. And I agree, it's too easy to say that you then become resistant to change, because that's not necessarily the case at all. But I would say that the risk here is that you start to kind of believe that actually there is one way of doing things, if that's the right way of putting it, and you start to sort of well, I guess it's about keeping a beginner's mindset. You know, it's like people talk about this idea of you know, the beginner's mind, which is really all about you're approaching things fresh, and you're not trying to you're not actually stuck in your way of thinking, I suppose is the way of putting it. And I think the most effective leaders from an innovation agility point of view that actually get to that level of experience still have curiosity, still are open-minded, still have that kind of beginner's mind. So to my mind, that would be my message to leaders, is you've got to try and work hard at keeping that.
I'm going to go way down the other end, not even just to the new joiners, Neil, but I'm thinking of students, right? People who already have an eye that they will enter the business world, as opposed to, you know, various other paths that their life might take. They know that they want to participate in that arena. They're reading books and hearing theories and hearing buzzwords and keywords. What's your message to them as they haven't even had their first day, but they will, and they're going to have, you know, 35, 40 years of days in the milieu? What's your message to those folks?
So I think I'm a big believer in the power of you know, people coming into a business to challenge norms and to you know, introduce new thinking. Of course, you've got to do it in the right way, but I think really I would like to encourage people to really believe that they can make change happen, and to be persistent and resilient about you know, wanting to make change happen for the better. Because I think so many organizations really do need that, and it is hugely valuable to them. So particularly large organizations, I think. So my message to them was don't give up. Yeah, just really believe that you can make change happen, because it can happen. And you know, really focus on you know, keeping your curiosity and learning as you go through your career, because there will always be opportunities to apply it in different ways. I guess the other thing is you know, one thing that actually bugs me a bit, actually, if I'm honest, is this idea of everyone, you know, just needs to find what they're really great at and what they're really enthusiastic at, and then that is their career. You know, it's just a matter of finding it. And I think what that kind of thing doesn't necessarily take account of is the fact that lots of people don't actually know what they want to do in life. And my message to those people is that there's nothing wrong with experimenting with your career, with trying stuff out. And you know, it's a lesson that I wish I'd known actually earlier in my career, is that it's okay to do that. It's okay to try things out and to find out whether because you will learn about what you like and what you don't like. But you know, so don't feel like it's a bad thing to actually, you know, want to try things and different things, and you know, just keep focused on the learning. Are you learning something? And if you're not, maybe that's time to move on.
Awesome messages. Those are great. Those are great thoughts. And I'm glad that we picked the two distant ends, because I get the sense, Neil, I could ask you about each intersection along the way and you'd have something equally good to share. But the theme that you're expert in, change and agility, I think is too frequently, there's assumptions around that in terms of stage of career, stage of vertical development in terms of what people are supposed to do and participate in. So I appreciate those messages.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree with you, actually. I think you're right. I mean, just because you have more experience and you get older doesn't mean that you suddenly become less agile, or that you shouldn't be interested in learning. I'm a big believer in lifelong learning. So, and there's absolutely no reason at all why, as a leader, you should get stuck in your ways, and you should respond, negatively to change. Because actually, I think the best leaders I know, and there are some great examples out there, I think do exactly the opposite.
Yeah. Well, like I shared with you, our focus is on how people teach and learn in the workplace. And you can almost consider it not as like, hey, don't worry, you have something to add, and almost take it further and say, you have a duty here. Nobody else in the organization's been around for 35 years. You kind of owe it to everybody to bring your experience to the table and say what you've seen, where your instincts lie, what you love and hate about the latest idea on the table, how it squares with your experience. You're the only gal at the table who can do that right now. Like it's a duty. And then maybe down the other end, nobody else is fresh blood. Everybody else has the curse of experience here. You're the only one coming in with totally fresh eyes. And so the fact that you're 22, if you go hide your lamp under a bushel, right? You're sort of depriving everybody of a duty that you almost owe to the organization, which is just to put in your 2 cents and say, look, from my eyes, as the one who hasn't been, steeped in any of this, it looks like this to me. So I think we could go beyond like, hey, you have the privilege and, you can get your voice in there. Almost like you had better not sit and be quiet. Because you kind of owe the other folks here a duty.
Yeah, I think one of the questions actually I would ask senior leaders, get them to ask themselves, is how do you react when somebody comes to you and says, I think this is wrong? It's like in many organizations, that old idea of sort of top-down hierarchy makes it very difficult for people to challenge leaders. And to my mind, the best leaders now welcome that kind of challenge, as long as it's well thought through and people are just, really coming to them with ideas and solutions and different ways of thinking about something. That's a hugely healthy thing. But some leaders don't like to be challenged, and particularly by somebody lower down the organization, and that's quite toxic, I think.
I wrote that down with an exclamation point behind it. What that means is we now at our shop have to workshop whether or not there's a attractive module with the title "How to Challenge Leaders." The trick there would be, I think, the how-to, rather than the just. If you leave off the how-to, it's just go challenge leaders, which isn't an exciting proposition. But if people sort of just discover an approach, then I think it should soften the leadership as well to say, hey, people who know how to bring a case and advocate for it is quite exciting, actually.
I can give you an example, actually, of a sector or an industry where this is really important, which is aviation. And the way that they train cockpit crews, pilots and first officers, is something called crew resource management. And crew resource management deliberately is there to train first officers and co-pilots on how they can challenge the pilot. And it came in actually after the worst air disaster in history, which was when 2 planes collided on the runway at Tel Aviv airport in the 1970s. And when they analysed what went wrong in that situation, they realised that the co-pilot had actually seen something but didn't speak up because he was afraid of, obviously speaking up and challenging the hierarchy in the cockpit. And so they brought in this whole way of training cockpit crews to enable them to actually challenge in the right situation if they believe that the pilot hasn't seen a key piece of information or is, not party to something which the rest of the crew are. So there are examples of industries which actually believe in this whole way of working. And I think there's lots of lessons you can draw from that.
I think there's a reason why sports and war are often the metaphors that get used for business, because the stakes are so high. In war, it's the negative stakes are extremely high. I suppose most of the positive ones are too, but lives are hanging in the balance. Many of them. In case of sports, it's kind of glory hanging in the balance, or agony of defeat. And I love case scenarios like the one that you gave, because the stakes are very high. If inside the hierarchy of a consulting firm somebody doesn't pipe up, it's like under optimized proposals go out or something. In the case of an airline, many people die and a bunch of expensive equipment is destroyed. But it still proves the case, right? It's no different. The fundamentals are no different, even though the stakes are lower. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I can just build on that, because I think you're right. There are a lot of analogies and parallels, that come from military strategy into corporate strategy, for good reasons often. But I think to use one of those, one of the key things that I talk a lot about in terms of organization agility is the ability to regularly realign and regularly reprioritize, of course. And many organizations don't have a formalized way of doing that, of building it into the fabric of how you work. And
Right.
if you take a military analogy there, something like the after action review, which is an example of what the American Marine Corps uses when they come back from a conflict situation, they align around what they call agreed facts and shared opinions. So agreed facts was what was meant to happen and what actually happened. And of course, you can be misaligned around that. People can have different views on what was supposed to happen there. But of course, shared opinions is, why was there a difference between those two things and what can we learn from it? And put simply, that's a way of actually making sure that you're actually drawing learnings from every single situation and then putting them into practice for next time. So that is a good analogy for the way in which organizations need to regularly review and do retrospectives and really understand how they can continuously improve.
I'm not physically jumping up and yelling amen, but I am inside, Neil. There's, for what it's worth, probably our best uptake module is called TMR, Tactical Meeting Review. And so this is just taking organizations only in the dimension of their client-facing exchanges and building a civilian, a business-based AAR, after action review. It has to take a slightly different shape, but it's taken shamelessly from the military AAR, and it's very, very effective learning mechanism. If you want to see 23-year-olds become 50-year-olds in their client-facing gravitas, you just have to put them under tactical meeting review for a year. It's amazing.
Yeah, I can believe that. I can believe it. And I just think, it's the kind of habitual thing which organizations should be doing and teams should be doing all the time, but so rarely do. And, and do it in a structured way. It's all about structured and organized learning, and just
Correct.
as a team, how you're able to learn. So I think there's so much value left on the table because organizations just don't do that.
Yeah, if you ever want a enthusiastic co-blogger or poster on the business of kind of agile learning and the idea of a technical review, I'm your man, or someone else at Sage's, because we're big believers and we've watched it now in many environments. Yeah. I'll cheerlead that with you. We've got a little bit of time left to go. What I'd like to ask you is what you're most interested in doing. Who are the audiences you're most interested in engaging with, how you write and speak and consult?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I love working with leadership teams in organizations. Senior leadership teams, I think, are fascinating to work with because I think working with them, you really understand some of the challenges that they face, the very real challenges often, some of the difficulties in trying to get stuff done in large organizations, some of the unique challenges they might have as a business, but also some of the very common sort of challenges that comes from having just, working in a large business. So I love working with leadership teams to navigate that and to help them understand how they can apply relatively simple tools and principles that actually enable them to change the way in which the organization itself works. And for me, I've been writing about Agile for over 10 years and consulting on it for the same period of time. And I think there's just huge value still in being able to apply these kinds of principles in ways that enable organizations to work differently and to really sort of catalyze the kind of thinking and application and innovation and experimentation, which are really needed in the context of a rapidly changing world that we all live and work in now.
It's great, Neil. Thank you for your time. When we share this, we're going to share building the agile business through digital transformation. It's the centerpiece that we've been trying to center the conversation around, but also Only Dead Fish and your website, which is your name, and the other books, which can just be found and purchased there too. Yeah. And then I think maybe more meaningfully, I could see folks wanting to pick up the thread and just connect with you, but you're easy to find and pretty easy to engage. I think if people find you, they'll find your website, and there's lots of nice little buttons for them to just say, hello, let's have a chat.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And so always welcome connections on LinkedIn, and I should be easy to find. It's Neil Perkin. So remember, there's no S on the end of Perkin. So Neil Perkin. And, if you just Google me, then you should be able to find my profile, website, and LinkedIn and so on. So, yeah, welcome all connections.
Superb. Thanks for all of that, Neil. I appreciate your time and great thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
No problem. Great to meet you, Kevin.
Okay, take care.